You have 3 years to live. It's pretty scary. Imagine how your clothes feel. Clothes? I said clothes. The average lifetime of a piece of clothing is 3 years, according to the Textile and Garment Recycling Facts and Figures from thebalancesmb.com, access June 14th of this year. 85% of clothing goes into landfills, which equates to 70 pounds per person. That's like a first grader. And unless you're playing like Cards Against Humanity, we do not want to throw first graders into landfills. Okay. So, 70 pounds per person, as stated on an infographic from the Council for Textile Recycling, found at where-donate-recycle.org, also accessed June 14th this year. I've been playing around with tie-dye since summer camp, circa 1997, and I started dyeing my vintage line May of last year, and I've been selling on various platforms since then. Dyeing clothes that you have of your own or that you have thrifted is really easy, and it's a way for you to participate in the sustainable fashion movement. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I like to dye, how to dye them, and a couple different techniques that you can try even as a beginner. First, I know you are dying to know what apparel items I prefer. So I like to dye vintage, specifically vintage lingerie and sleepwear. And if you're wondering, like, is vintage even still relevant these days? It is. So according to the newspaper article by Eric Schwartzberg, published July 8th, 2016, called New Middletown Business Features Vintage Clothing and Lingerie, the shop owner is quoted saying that vintage isn't a hot commodity right now. Vintage will always be a hot commodity. People love remembering a past time, especially when it reminds them of someone that they love. So I like to dye sleepwear, and my first example of sleepwear, or this is really loungewear. So that is an example of what to dye. It's made of nylon fabric, and nylon is oftentimes confused with satin because it has like this nice sheen to it. So nylon is super great. It's a really great textile to dye, and it comes out generally very well and very like potent with the color. So I also will dye cotton fabric. Cotton is very common, very breathable, great to wear to bed. And I like to dye sleepwear because that way if you mess up, like who's gonna see? You know, you, people you live with, whatever. But it's not an apparel item that you would wear out on the street and be like, oh crap, I messed up this dress and everyone can see. You know, not anything, you know, that's a big deal. So another thing I like to dye is intimates. So vintage slips, bras, underwear, socks. I'm not going to show you those, but socks especially, and underwear too, are really great for practicing. So practicing techniques, practicing colors, like creating swatches. So here's a vintage slip. I really love this color. So it's kind of like a really deep aqua. Right, so intimates, slips are probably my favorite thing. I'm crazy for them. So you can wear them to bed. Back in the day, people wore them underneath dresses, and it just kind of like smoothed out the dress, any kind of lines. So like we should really bring those back. I'm telling you, vintage slips, that's where it's at. Okay, so having gone over what I prefer to dye, I will share with you what to dye with. So let's get right to the point. So the garment behind me, I use this product. So good thing the cap is on tight. All right, RIT liquid dye. I really like this. I can control how much dye very easily with the liquid. And this is one of my favorite colors. This is tropical teal, right? And then this is RIT has two different types of liquid. They have the all-purpose And the first garment I had up, I used this color. It's called apple green. So this is the all-purpose, and then this is synthetic. So all-purpose, I literally use it on most everything. Um, Nylon, cotton, linen, wool, silk. These are your natural fibers. And then polyester. So whenever I work with something that has chiffon or satin, I will use the synthetic one. Okay. And then, so I use RIT, cotton, nylon, poly. And then what I also use, I do the bucket method. You can do it on the stove top, but because I like mass produce my items, these are my two buckets. And I will use this spatula ladle thing, this big spoon. I will use this big spoon to stir. I have my rubber gloves here. And when I want to get really creative, I will paint with dye. It's very hard, but I have makeup brushes. So I could use, there's dye pens, like fabric pens. The tips of them are too rough for the type of materials I use. This can pill rather easily, it can rip. So I don't use those, but my makeup brushes, very fine point, I will use both of these for dyeing, picking up the dye. And then, as I will get to in a moment, I have my rolling pin. You would think you'd use this for dough. Nope, I use it for something entirely different. So, when I use my nylon products, I do hot water, I do some vinegar, a splash of vinegar, and a little bit of dish soap. I kind of just eyeball that. I've gotten used to baking with them, those items now. And then when I dye with cotton and other cotton and linen, I will use salt in the dye bath. Just put it in the bucket here. This is a 3-gallon. It holds 3 gallons of the water. And I use about half of a bottle for, it's like two adult shirts. We use half of it. So I would do like 3 slips for half of a bottle. So, and it really depends on how saturated I want the item, how much color, and yeah, so just depends on the hue I want it to take, how deep, and then how faded I want it, how light. So, as you can see, I root for RIT, also because their website is very easy to navigate and shares some really fun techniques that you can add to your bucket list. All right. So one technique that I have to show you is called, alright, so this is the Arashi Shibori method, and of course I have it on a slip. On the website they have it with cotton, and for this it is classically used with indigo dye, and this slip was pure white before. You can see the straps have maintained their color, so this was all white. And what you do is you fold it like a fan. So you fold the fabric, and then I literally wrapped it around my rolling pin because this is what I had available. Thank you, coronavirus. So I wrapped around. You can use any kind of, like, they recommend a pole pipe or whatever, but I wrapped it around. So just snaked it around after I folded it, and then I smooshed it together. So you can see this is not dyed, but this part is dyed. So I smooshed it to the very end, and I held it in place with thin rubber bands. So if you were to look closely, you could see very thin lines here. I generally avoid using rubber bands on my vintage textiles just because rubber bands are, not very friendly on hair and, things like that. So I don't want them, they're too rough. I don't want them hurting my vintage textiles. So I will just use a couple just to hold it in place, and then I will just let this hang out in the dye bucket, just stay there. And I generally let my items sit in the dye bucket for about 30 minutes until they get really saturated to the amount that I want them to, and I stir pretty consistently. Bring your phone with you away from the dye bucket, but I will just stay there at the sink, tethered to the sink, and just do other things on my phone that I need to do, check my email, whatever, while the items sit, and then every like few minutes stir it. So that way I know that the dye is getting through every part of the fabric and it's not just in place and getting crevices there that aren't, you know, getting the liquid that I want it to. So to get the most saturated, full distribution of the color, you want to stir it. And then, so that's the shibori method there. And then another technique that I kind of accidentally came upon. So I call this, it's kind of like the shibori method, but I call this my space dye or galaxy. So I put about half of the quantity that I'm planning on using into the dye bucket first, and then I put my items in there, and then I layer it. So then I'll put the other part of the dye on top of my items after they're in there. And what's interesting is that like when the item goes into the dye bucket, when the dye's in there, like it starts absorbing right away. So we have like the base color in there, but then I add more dye on top of the item, and so it's taking on the dye that comes in on top, but I mean, not like a whole lot of it. So it just has this really cool effect, and it comes out different every time, but it kind of just looks like a galaxy kind of there. So just I play with the different parts. It's not always 50-50 equal parts. I like to do actually more dye on top of the item when it's already in there. So those are the two techniques I like to do, the shibori and the galaxy or space dye. There are more techniques that you can learn on their website, like ice dye. I'm excited to try that soon, and marbling for you to discover. Today I gave you a brief overview about dyeing fabric, specifically what I like to dye, what dye product I use, and some techniques for you to try as a beginner. Let your clothes see their 4th birthday and celebrate your anniversary by refreshing their look together. You can dye clothes in a pattern that, you know, or a color that is significant, and boom, you have a unique handmade gift for someone. It can be like their graduation colors from school. It can be, if you go to a wedding, their wedding colors, dye something like that, right? And all the while, you are becoming a historical preservationist. You are a landfill rescuer, a champion of the apparel industry, a hero of the earth. Tony Stark once said, "We might not be able to save planet Earth, but you're damn sure will avenge it."